My name is Paul William Mason. I'm 57 years old and I'm from Alnwick, Northumberland. I was 19 years old in 1980.
And what kind of things did you do, social-wise?
Social-wise, when I went, in 1980, 19 years old, I just left college, Ashington Technical College. Spent 3 years there studying for an ordinary National Diploma in Business Studies. So left there expecting to just go straight into a job in bank, building society, civil service, and basically spent 2 years on the dole trying to find a job.
So what did you do socially, like for fun, with your friends and things like that? Did you go out in pubs?
Yes, not a lot for the 2 years I was on the dole, because I think you only got about £10 every fortnight. And most of that went to pay for my board because I was still living with my mum and dad. Just basically socialising was going to the pub for a drink with mates.
Pubs in Alnwick?
Pubs in Alnwick, yeah. There was a lot more pubs in Alnwick back then than what there is now. If I remember rightly, something like 21 or 22, whereas now it's down to about, not even sure there's a dozen.
So has the social life in Alnwick changed a great deal from the 80s?
Yes, in terms of back then, it was pubs were very, very busy, and if you went out on your own, you weren't on your own because you could walk into a pub and there would be people that you knew and knew probably quite well, and that would be every single pub you went into. Nowadays, I can walk into a pub outside my local pub and could be in a pub in Alnwick all night and not even know anybody.
It's a big difference.
Yeah. Plus the kind of the way people drinks changed as well. Now it seems to be people drink in the house because obviously it's a lot cheaper, and then come out very late in the day. So come down to the pubs which have a lock-in, or Penny Black or the Mail House, whatever that sort of nightclub place is, but it's a bit young for me.
You could ask which time he prefers for socialising, like 80s or now, which is better for socialising.
That's cool. That was a good question. That's a little bit summing stuff up. So let's break down social life. All the different areas. So music, television, film, sports, hobbies.
What kind of music were you into in the 80s?
Very much the 80s music. I was never into rock music, heavy metal, that type of thing. I was very much kind of a Culture Club, Spandau Ballet, Thompson Twins, Level 42, the Human League. It was very much that sort of, I don't know what you called it, soft romantic, whatever. So it was more, that was my sort of music.
Do you remember Live Aid?
Very much so. It's I think it must have been the first kind of live event on TV. It had never been done like that before. I remember watching it from, I don't know what time it started, maybe 10 o'clock in the morning, and it went on till like midnight. It was a massive, massive event. As I say, I was still living at home then, and I made my parents watch it as well, and they weren't really into music, but the Queen were absolutely fantastic on that, just amazing. And I haven't seen Bohemian Rhapsody yet, but I know they recreate Live Aid in that film.
Yeah, it's unreal. What kind of concerts did you go to? Did you ever see any of your favourite bands live?
Yeah. Every one of them I mentioned, saw them live several times. Culture Club, Spandau Ballet, Thompson Twins, Level 42, Human League, China Crisis. At one time, probably about 83, 84, I was probably going to a concert a week.
Wow. How much
Probably back then, I'd be about maybe it's 10 quid, 8 quid, 10 quid. So I think prices are pretty comparable to today, I would think. Your sort of City Hall, Metro Arena, not your Wembleys, which are where you can pay hundreds for a ticket.
I mean, my One Direction ticket was £56. A lot of money.
No, I wouldn't pay £5 to go and see One Direction.
Okay, these are hurtful comments, everybody. Film-wise, what kind of films did you?
I was very much into horror. So
noise in the background and stuff there. Let's go for that again, please.
What kind of films did you watch in the 80s?
I was very much into horror films. So in the sort of early 80s, you had A Nightmare on Elm Street came out, American Werewolf in London. One of my all-time favourite horror films came out in 1982, The Thing, with Kurt Russell. And I still watch that today just because of the effects in it. I was very much into, how did they do that effect? How did they actually make that slit throat look like that? So I used to buy a lot of magazines that kind of showed you that and how it was all worked out.
The friends you had in the 80s, are they still people you knock around with?
Yeah. I mean, still people that I went to school with in primary school. So people I sort of got to know when I was 4 years old. I still know them now. I still have a drink with some of them now.
Did you play like sport or anything? Were you really into football? Anything like that?
I liked sports, but I was a kid at school. I was the sort of one to get picked last for some reason. But yeah, I mean, I kind of got into sports kind of later on after I'd kind of left school, started playing five-a-side and things like that. But I supported Newcastle United, as lots of people do. Back then, you couldn't get a ticket because I think the ground was only 36,000, and there was a 10,000 waiting list for season tickets. So I attended. There was a couple of mates that were season ticket holders, so they would get us tickets to away games. So I saw Newcastle United more times away than I ever saw them at St James's Park.
Do you remember how much a football ticket was?
I don't, and as I say, I never managed to get a season ticket, but I think it would probably, in today's terms, they'd be cheaper than what they are now, I would imagine.
In 1992, you could get in the corner of St James's Park for £3.
£56 was my first season ticket. That's all.
What? I've just tried to buy tickets for the Fulham game for me, my brother and my mum, and it's going to be over 100 quid for 3 tickets. It's a joke.
Yeah.
It's more probably anyway, sorry, I digress.
So don't digress from that though. So maybe ask about the team. What was the team like at the time? Were they doing well? Who was his favourite player? Stuff like that.
Yeah. So were you a big Newcastle United supporter?
Wouldn't say I was a big Newcastle United supporter. Supported them in terms of they weren't really doing that well back then, from what I remember. Not sort of, well, they haven't won anything since the Fairs Cup in whenever that was.
1969.
Do you remember Kevin Keegan's hat?
Yeah, well, yeah. And again, I mean, obviously it was later than the 80s when Kevin Keegan came along, and sorry, that was later when he was managing. But I mean, sorry, my mind's just gone completely blank.
No worries at all. No worries at all. Do you remember the Alnwick Fair?
Alnwick Fair, yeah. That's back then. Everybody used to take a week off work. So that's what I used to do anyway. Book a week off work so that you weren't getting up in the morning with hangovers and going to work.
It's a big thing.
Massive. And where I worked at the tax office, we used to get a half day. like half day book she half day off just for the Annick Fair.
What happened at this fair to make it so big?
I think it was just the whole town just got involved, got dressed up. All the shops got dressed up. Basically, everybody was kind of involved. And it was probably, and I remember that more than, say, it bringing people from out of town, like tourists coming in to see it. I just remember it as nearly everybody that I knew and that was dressed up. And then in the pubs, most pubs had like different sorts of games on, again to bring people into the pubs, and every single one was heaving. You couldn't get into some of them, so you were like drinking outside on the streets. And it was just a massive social week. Like I say, most of everybody that I knocked around with at the time, they all took a week off work.
What kind of house did you live in the 80s?
It was a 3-bedroom council house,
Where was that?
Greensfield Avenue in Annick.
Who did you live with?
My mum and dad and my brother. By 1980, my sister had married and moved out. My older sister.
How long were you at home for?
I didn't actually leave home until 1993 when I bought my first house. So in the 80s, I basically lived with my parents throughout the whole of the 1980s and throughout the whole of my 20s, basically.
How was that?
Sorry?
How was that for you?
Really good. I mean, a little bit of ahead of its time, because that's what I think a lot of young people do now. They tend to leave home a lot later because buying a house is so expensive now. Back in the 80s, it was obviously comparably, it was a lot cheaper.
Parents buy the house eventually?
They did eventually, but more towards the end of the 80s. My dad could have bought a house a lot earlier. He worked abroad, so he earned quite a bit of money. Although he he liked to drink and he liked to gamble, so so at times it was a bit of a struggle. Again, once I got a job, I was able to contribute more into the household and pay bills and things like that.
Wait, stop.
Yeah, sorry.
So,
like,
right?
Well, so break that down then. What type of house was it? Like, what was the street and the community like? What, what did you think the right to buy? Stuff like that.
What did you think of the right to buy?
I thought it was a really good thing in terms of it allowed sort of working class who wouldn't necessarily have bought a property, because that kind of did that generational thing about renting property. So it was a good thing, but what I didn't agree with was the fact that they allowed people to buy up all these council properties, but then didn't allow the councils to reinvest that money, so that councils weren't then rebuilding and replacing the council houses. So you were always going to end up in a position where there wasn't enough affordable housing later on, which is kind of a position we're in now. So part of it I agreed with, but part of it they should have done something about replacing all the properties that they were selling off.
Can you tell me what your opinion is of Margaret Thatcher?
Very strong-willed woman, and probably somebody that we need now with Brexit. But no, very strong-willed woman. At the time, it's what was needed, I think, to do what had to be done back in the 80s in terms of unions having so much power. What wasn't nice was the way they went about it, and the fact that what they did destroyed communities in some places.
Did you condone what she did with up here, in particular in the north? Some people say that the north has not recovered from Margaret Thatcher's reign.
No, but in terms of what happened, industries were on the decline. Even back then, I think the kind of, industries were kind of on a bit of a decline. It was going to be a lot more expensive to keep shipbuilding going, and all the other various industries and things. So the government of the day needed somebody very strong to lead them through that, and Margaret Thatcher was definitely a strong leader.
What do you remember of the miners' strike?
To be honest, it was like it was more what I saw on the TV as to what I saw kind of locally. So it was, and I think the sort of community side of things where they were destroyed, it was, I don't think up here it didn't seem to be as bad as what it was like, say, down in Yorkshire and places like that. Although, I mean, like Sir Pegswood and Ashington around there, that was probably where in the northeast that the communities were really, really affected. It didn't seem to have that effect like closer to Alnwick in terms of Shilbottle, Whittle. It was kind of more like what was happening around Ashington, Pegswood, Guidepost, that kind of area. And I was still sort of in touch at the time with people that I'd gone to Ashington Technical College with. Some of them were like from Pegswood and Ashington. Some of them were in communities and families that basically it split the family down the middle, and brothers stopped speaking to brothers, fathers to sons, and that kind of carried on for years and years and years afterwards. With some of the people that I knew from that kind of Ashington Pegswood area, where they just didn't speak for years and years and years. And as I say, some communities where that's that effect's still there now.
It's sad to think though that something that happened 30 years ago, it still has a knock-on effect today and has affected communities.
Yeah. But again, it's like those massive kind of like industries that we as a country were well known for around the world, that just died off, and now we're very much, in this day and age, we're very much a service industry, not like a revolutionary industry where we were making ships, we were producing coal, making steel that was like famous around the world. That was all lost, and there's an argument that says we should have kept that investment going, and we might have still had those industries today, but we would have been competing against the likes of China, places like that can make it a lot cheaper than we ever could. But again, back in the 80s, another thing that made coal so expensive was because the wages were so high. So you were never going to be able to sell, and it was the same, in the shipbuilding and places like that, where they had very strong unions, so they had very very high wages. So if we had kept those industries and invested in those industries, our products would have been expensive compared to the rest of the world, and because China, they pay very low wages comparable to ourselves, so they can obviously sell their products a lot cheaper.
What did you think of the way the police handled the miners' strike? Do you have an opinion on that?
Brutally. But again, I never personally saw it, but it was just what you'd see on the television, read in the newspapers. But it was again very brutal. But the police would have been ordered to do certain things, so they were just trying to make sure that the picket line was peaceful. But back in them days, unlike today, where you've got very strict laws around strikes and picket lines, back then there was nothing. There was nothing like that. So basically, you had violence. Where some people who were prepared to cross the picket line, scabs as they were called back then. But again, I knew sort of mates who had, they got married, they had like a baby, so they were crossing the picket line because they needed to earn a wage to feed their family. So, and they were prepared to cross the picket line to go to work to get a wage, because to them they had a responsibility. They had to put food on the table and whatnot.
People turned on them for doing something like that.
Yeah. And very viciously. And again, that for years afterwards, you had that, where people had crossed the picket line. They were treated really abominably for years and years afterwards. But in their minds, they were doing that because they needed to feed their family.
So nothing was really ever the same again after that strike?
In those communities that were really, really badly affected, I think it took years and years and years. I wouldn't say they're still affected today. I think there will be if you really got into those communities and you were speaking to people that were really badly affected, then I think that's when you would find that they still probably, there's families that the things haven't repaired themselves or whatever.
They'll be getting an employment benefit, they won't be paying their taxes, they won't be buying as much bread, milk, whatever. Do you not think that had an adverse effect on our economy, even though, what I'm trying to say is there not a chance that it was sort of a short-term solution?
Not very much so, because, and again, it's like, it wasn't just kind of like what they did with the mines and the shipbuilding, etc. They weren't investing in the railways, so the railway structure fell apart, and we're seeing the effects of that now. With where the railways, it's the overcrowding because the trains aren't as good, the railway lines aren't as good, the signalling is not as good. But I think as well in the 80s, when I think back, that was probably when the UK started to become this financial world base that we have now, where, like I said before, we're very much a service industry country, very much a financial industry country. So I don't know where all that lack of investment, so where all that funding went back then. No, well, no, yeah.
To the rich people.
Well, yeah, because in this country, and it's something that again, my dad's, I remember he said it, and I believe it to this day. One of my dad's favourite sayings was, 90% of the wealth in this country is owned by 10% of the population, and that has been the case for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's kind of why we have the class system with your upper class, you know, your, I'm not going to say who, but your Dukes of Northumberland, you know, your lords and all that, who they own 90% of the wealth in this country. They probably kind of run the country. I mean, it doesn't matter what government is in power, whether it's Labour, Conservative, or a coalition. Civil servants run the country, because you have civil servants in the Treasury and all of the, you know, in it's like civil, you know, so it doesn't matter which government's in power, those civil servants don't change. They're all, you know, it's the same. So they have a lot to do with the actual running of the country, from in terms of, you know, yeah, like household bills and how you'd run a household. You might live in the house, but it's, you know, it's your job that gives you the money to be able to do things like build a conservatory and things like that. I didn't realize I was going to get that political.